It is universally accepted that encountering a ferocious bear is one of the most dreadful ordeals one could face. The danger was even more threatening before advancements in medical technology and emergency response systems. Yet this tale takes it a step further. We are about to unravel the renowned story of an individual who was savagely brutalized by a bear in extreme isolation and subsequently abandoned by his fellow companions in a merciless wilderness. Please proceed with caution. The events shared in this anecdote, while brief and not explicitly detailed, may be unsettling to some. The story of Hugh Glass is rather unique compared to others on our channel, which are usually meticulously vetted for accuracy and based on diverse resources. For the sake of preserving the truth, it is important to remember that much of Hugh's history is unauthenticated. Many details vary wildly, falling anywhere between reality and embellishment. Much of the available information came down through generations orally, which, as we all know, can be altered and mistaken. Moreover, due to frequent portrayals in popular media, it is extremely difficult to sift the genuine from the fabricated these days. The tale is possibly recognized best from the Academy Award-winning film The Revenant from 2015, where actor Leonardo DiCaprio portrays Hugh. Although the film's plotline somewhat mirrors Hugh's story, a fair share of details are either uncertain, uncorroborated, or, without a doubt, fabricated. Therefore, as I narrate this tale, I will stick to the facts but maintain a cautionary stance. Whenever possible, I will portray various renditions of particular incidents to present a comprehensive narrative of the intrigue surrounding the man and his real-life ordeals. With all this disclosed, it is believed that Hugh was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1783 to an Irish family. Unfortunately, we know very little about his youth, how he was brought up, or his early adult years. The legend truly takes off in the early 1830s when, according to some documents, he left behind his wife and 2 children to embark on a new life journey as a sea captain off the coast of Texas. In 1816, his ship was raided by pirates under the infamous Jean Lafitte. Hugh and his crew were faced with an ultimatum: either join the pirates or face a painful demise. Without hesitation, Hugh decided to join the pirates, spending around 2 years causing havoc and damage for Lafitte until his escape in 1818. Following his escape, Hugh and a friend safely moved from Galveston Island via the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, eventually reaching the mainland of Texas. However, their issues were far from over. Heading northward, they navigated through lands inhabited by some rather hostile Native American tribes. The Karankawa, known for their alarming cannibalistic tendencies, dominated a significant portion of the Texas coast. Nevertheless, Hugh and his friend navigated through their territory undetected. As they pushed further north, they found themselves in the lands of the Comanche and Kiowa tribes. They managed to stay under the radar there too, but eventually ran into the Pawnee in present-day Kansas. The Pawnee may not have been keen on consuming human flesh, but they were known to practice human sacrifice. Typically, their Morning Star ritual centered on a young, captive female. However, in this instance, they chose to use Hugh and his friend, commencing with the latter. The man was fixed to a stake, pine splinters were embedded in his skin, and then he was set ablaze. The man quickly succumbed to the flames, leaving no traces behind. Faced with a similar fate, Hugh decided to try and pacify the chief. He produced a bottle of cinnabar, commonly used in the making of red war paint, makeup, and pottery, from his pocket. The chief found it appealing, and surprisingly enough, Hugh was warmly welcomed into the tribe. He would peacefully reside with the Pawnee for 4 years before moving on. Throughout this time, those who met Hugh described him as particularly courageous, audacious, and astute. However, it was the Pawnee who taught him how to survive and flourish in the wilderness. Upon leaving the tribe in 1822, Hugh stumbled upon a call for 100 men to embark on a fur trading journey with General William Henry Ashley up the Missouri River. Hugh would not join what was known as Ashley's 100 until the subsequent year, at which point they set off on their 1,500-plus-mile expedition along the Missouri River in search of beaver pelts. Months later, the men opted to row their boats upstream, maintaining constant vigilance for possible encounters with hostile Native American tribes. Eventually, in what is presently known as South Dakota, Ashley's 100 came into land owned by the Arikara tribe, a tribe that played a notable role in the tale of Lewis and Clark on their expedition to the west. Notably, Lewis and Clark encountered the Arikara in 1804 and persuaded them to send a delegation to Washington, D.C., which was accomplished in the following year. Regrettably, while in Washington, the Arikara chief passed away, and the tribe held the settlers responsible for his demise. Henceforth, the Arikara posed a violent danger to settlers traversing their land, a pattern that was observed repeatedly. Like many Native American tribes, the Arikara chose to settle near rivers and streams. When Ashley's 100 approached via the river, they inevitably entered a village. Surprisingly, the tribe welcomed the expedition, and both sides conducted several trades. However, once the trading ceased, the Arikara ambushed Ashley's 100, taking 12 lives and injuring another dozen, including Hugh. Despite the attack, the group managed to escape, and 3 months later, after traversing further up the Missouri River, the survivors reached dry land, marching 300 miles to a fur trade fort. However, still within Arikara territory, the group had to remain vigilant and discreet to avoid detection. Simultaneously, survival necessitated the group to hunt deer or buffalo every couple of days, with the resulting gunshots potentially heard for miles. Inevitably, in June of 1823, the Arikara launched another attack on the party, further thinning their ranks. The remaining survivors eventually found their way to Fort Kiowa to convalesce and rest. While at the fort, the party was joined by a man named Andrew Henry, who was Ashley's expedition co-lead. He was then appointed to head a small group, which included Hugh, directing them west to the Yellowstone River. Upon reaching the division of the Grand River in current-day South Dakota, the men decided to split up in search of game. Tentatively making his way through the forest, Hugh accidentally startled a grizzly bear along with her 2 cubs. Hugh's rifle was far from adequate against an onrushing bear, yet he didn't manage to react swiftly enough to take a shot either. As the mother bear approached him, she clawed at Hugh's neck, secured her teeth into the nape of his neck, and then tossed him about. The subsequent proceedings are a topic of disagreement, and I wish to signal a heads up. The details are concise and non-graphic, but Hugh's damage was nevertheless severe. One version of the tale hints that the bear continued to assault Hugh until he could fight back and terminate the bear. In another version, Hugh cried out for assistance, and the rest of the group arrived and put an end to the bear. Regardless of the reality, Hugh was indeed targeted by a bear and was clearly in dire straits, with his wounds thoroughly detailed in diaries penned by other group members. The bear's assault had caused a gash in his neck so severe that his breath could be seen escaping it as he respired. He had sustained severe wounds all over his body, including his scalp, and another injury on his back was so deep that it exposed his ribs. More worrisome was the fact that their location was so isolated that the closest human habitation was the fort where they had taken a resting session, hundreds of miles away. Even if there were anything closer at bay, it was evident to the rest of the group that Hugh's chances of survival were slim. He was alert, but his breathing was strained, and he was unable to utter a syllable. However, Hugh shocked them by surviving the first evening and a few ensuing days. Yet they were confident that it was only a matter of time until he surrendered to his wounds. As Hugh's survival exceeded their predictions, and considering they still had to proceed with their voyage, Andrew proposed that some of the men construct a makeshift litter to transport Hugh until he passed away. This considerably delayed their pace, and after a couple of days navigating the challenging landscape, Andrew requested 2 men to remain with Hugh until his demise while the rest advanced. A substantial extra payment was to be made to the volunteers, and a man named John stepped up for the task, quickly followed by another man named Jim, a mere 19 years old. Chosen to linger out of reverence to Hugh, Jim wished to ensure a deserving last tribute for him. Hence, the rest of the group continued their journey, while the volunteer duo began digging Hugh's grave. In the subsequent days, John and Jim managed to hydrate Hugh through the gash in his neck, but most of the initial few days he spent oscillating between states of consciousness. Soon he developed a severe fever, and termination seemed inevitable. One variant of the tale says that the fever signaled to John that their assigned task was completed, so John and Jim quickly gathered Hugh's rifle, knife, flint, gunpowder, and unnecessary supplies before emerging along the path the rest of the group had departed days earlier. In another version, John and Jim found themselves under attack by Arikara warriors, forcing them to flee with Hugh's rifle in tow. Though scholars tend to lean toward the credibility of the first narrative, regardless of the truth, through his fever-induced haze, Hugh caught every word the two men exchanged while taking his possessions, knowing full well they were effectively leaving him to meet his end. Whether this was a catalyst for survival or not, after a few more days, Hugh's fever subsided, and he experienced a clarity of senses. Following this, it's uncertain what made this particular item so valuable, but the rifle that the men had taken from Hugh held sentimental ties, and he became resolute in his intention to reclaim it. When the moment arrived, he examined his decaying physical condition in shock. His injuries were a gruesome sight, infected and crawling with maggots. Now, as unsettling as it may sound, there are instances where this is actually beneficial because maggots consume the infected tissue and encourage recovery. Instead of attempting to clean the wound, he left it as it was. In the aftermath, Hugh found sustenance from a nearby buffalo berry bush. He managed to harvest some of the berries, mashed them into a puree, mixed it with spring water, and swallowed the concoction. A few days later, he noticed a rattlesnake approaching him. Within striking distance, Hugh pounced, striking the snake repeatedly with a rock. Having removed the venomous head, and given his limited mobility and lack of fire-making supplies, Hugh resorted to consuming the snake raw. The duration of his immobility and recovery in the forest remains unknown, but his ever-improving condition prompted a need for a strategic plan. Upright movement was impossible with his fractured leg. He needed to find his way back to Fort Kiowa, even if crawling was his only means of transportation. However, the enormous distance to Fort Kiowa, approximately 200 miles, presented a substantial challenge. Tales vary on how he found his way back to civilization. Some accounts suggest he managed to set his broken leg himself and crawled substantial miles before regaining his ability to stand. From that point forward, he allegedly hobbled and faltered the remainder of the distance, managing to make it back to Fort Kiowa within a 6-week time frame. In another account, he hauled himself through the wilderness, deploying every survival skill he could muster, even going to the lengths of scaring off a wolf pack from a buffalo carcass to nourish himself and dry strips of meat for his impending journey. At a certain junction in this narrative, members of the Sioux tribe discovered him, took him under their wings, and transported him to Fort Kiowa. After a stint at the fort where Hugh restored his health and regained his strength, he armed himself with some clothes and a rifle, harboring intentions of braving the wild yet again to reconcile with the Ashley group. Feeling a sense of betrayal and grievance for being unjustly stripped of his belongings by John and Jim, Hugh was hell-bent on seeking them out and getting justice. When he was all set to embark, Hugh encountered some French-Canadian fur traders at the fort who were also headed to the Yellowstone River. Sensing an opportunity to find John and Jim, he decided to accompany these fur traders. The journey upstream was uneventful for 6 weeks until they were ambushed by the Arikara once more. During the assault, Hugh and the traders were on firm ground and dispersed along the riverbank. The offensive took the group by such surprise that only one trader survived. Remarkably, Hugh also escaped unscathed, thanks to his hunting activities away from the riverbank at that moment. Following this harrowing experience, Hugh found himself solo once again in the vast wilderness, but was obviously better prepared now. With not a shred of hesitation, he forged ahead even as winter descended. On New Year's Eve, Hugh found himself at the junction where the Bighorn River merges with the Yellowstone River. And sure enough, that's where he ran into Ashley's group. As he emerged from the woods, those still part of the group were gobsmacked. It was akin to seeing an apparition. After all, John and Jim had convinced them that Hugh was no more, and now he stood right in their midst. When he approached them, though, it was apparent that he wasn't there for idle chit-chat. Demanding to see John and Jim instantly, he was informed that John had parted ways with the group shortly after leaving Hugh and had enlisted in the military. Jim, however, was still part of the Ashley group and spotted by Hugh. Determined to take Jim's life, Hugh locked onto him. But when cornered, Hugh slowly let his rifle drop. It was in this moment that Hugh realized that Jim was still an impressionable young man and likely succumbed to John's influence when they decided to take his valuables and abandon him. Furthermore, Jim was deeply regretful toward Hugh and expecting a shot, but instead Hugh shouted at Jim but ultimately spared his life. The next matter to address was the rifle, but Jim explained its absence. John had it with him when he enlisted in the army. After their altercation, Hugh re-entered as a part of the Ashley expedition, and just before March the following year, Andrew tasked Hugh and 4 other men with the delivery of mail to Fort Atkinson, presently known as Nebraska. After delivering the mail at a fort, Hugh was instructed to head on to St. Louis and inform the expedition's financiers of the new location at the Bighorn and Yellowstone Fork. The journey commenced, and Hugh started hunting buffalo for boats, known as bull boats, to facilitate water travel. Traveling by water was quicker than on foot, thus using the buffalo's large bones to construct a frame. Hugh wrapped the animal's hide around the bones, constructing a small waterproof vessel. Once the boats were ready, they sailed into the northern Platte River, covering much more distance in less time, as predicted. Their journey continued until they reached an Arikara village, almost predictably at this stage. One narration claims they were instantly under siege, while another observes the tribe's head welcoming them into the village, a tactic previously witnessed by Hugh. The friendship between them remains unclear, but according to this version, the head recognized or had heard of Hugh and invited him to smoke. However, while with the chief, Hugh spotted other tribe members robbing their boat. When Hugh caught them red-handed, the Arikara launched their attack, resulting in 2 of the 5 crew members' deaths. Hugh, along with the 2 others, managed to escape into the river, but in the chaotic escape, he lost the rifle he had acquired from Fort Kiowa. Yet again, alone and unarmed, Hugh ventured another 400 miles to Fort Atkinson. Like many times before, Hugh covered this long distance on foot and, upon arrival, discovered that Fort Atkinson was coincidentally John's military base. Similar to most parts of this story, there exist 2 versions of the following events, but both resulted in John surviving. In the first narration, there was a significant impediment between Hugh and the vengeance he intensely longed for. Ending the life of a U.S. Army soldier within a U.S. Army fort equated to only one fate, and that was Hugh's termination. Therefore, before parting ways with the fort to traverse to St. Louis, Hugh cautioned John with a message. Should Hugh sever his ties with the Army in the future, he would be waiting to seek vengeance. Alternatively, in another narrative, Hugh bestows forgiveness upon John, as he had on Jim, devoid of any parting menace. In alignment with both narratives, an Army captain retrieves Hugh's firearm from John's quarters and returns it to the original owner. This is when the saga of Hugh Glass concludes until he resurfaces in 1833. Amid a fur trading journey, his fortunate streak came to an abrupt halt when the Arikara launched an attack, leading to the demise and scalp of Hugh and 2 others. It is estimated that Hugh would have been around 50 years old then and was possibly laid to rest in an anonymous grave near Bighorn, Montana. To recap, we can affirm that Hugh Glass existed and was assaulted by a bear. However, the remaining intricacies of the narrative remain vague. Someone could have indeed been as tenacious and auspicious as Hugh, weathering all storms and narrowly escaping death on numerous occasions. Though it's equally plausible that certain parts of his narrative have been amplified, altered, or simply lost in the lapses of the 2 centuries since their occurrence. Nonetheless, heartfelt gratitude for tuning in. Should you have any tale suggestions, kindly drop them in the suggestion box found in the description link, and hopefully I will see you in our next episode.